I have a number. I want to actually explore this idea, freedom as the ability to respond. I want to explore it from multiple lenses and not in a super formal way, but I will tell you kind of what lenses I'm intending to bring to the topic. I want to think about what trauma studies might say in this regard. I want to think about what awareness of human development and attachment theory across the lifespan might say to this. I want to look at how philosophers might look at this question, and I want to bring in a couple of vague examples from the Hebrew Bible. I guess they're meaningful to me, but I haven't yet quite formulated how I want to talk about them. And then I want to close actually by sharing an image with you. I'm not going to share a PowerPoint. I decided I'm just going to copy some of these quotes that I'm referencing into the chat in case anyone finds it helpful to see it written out. But at the end, I'm going to put an image up on the screen, and I'm going to ask each of us to look at the different symbols and pictures there and be curious for ourselves today. What facet of freedom is beckoning to you to lean into today? So that's how I'd like to close and transition us into a discussion piece. So let me start with a quote. I want to start with a quote. This is from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And he writes, he says, Judaism is supremely a religion of freedom. Not freedom in the modern sense, the ability to do what we like, but in the ethical sense of the ability to do what we should, to become co-architects with God of a just and gracious social order. The former leads to a culture of rights, the latter to a culture of responsibilities. Judaism is faith as responsibility. And I suppose I start by citing a rabbi, because my field of my graduate studies, my PhD is in Hebrew Bible, and so it's kind of a starting point for me when I come to various topics. And I think that the pieces, and it's so hard to decide what to bring up when there are so many different, I would say, experts and deep thinkers in these various fields who have grappled with this, and I am only beginning to be aware of their work. And so I understand what I'm bringing up is quite it's selective in the sense that I am simply sharing the pieces from each of these fields of study that I have found helpful recently. I'm not attempting to give an overview, of what this field might offer to the discussion. But in the realm of trauma studies, the part of this that I'm thinking about, I watched last night maybe I'll put the title of this in the chat, because there's a film that just started screening for the first time this week. It's called Where Olive Trees Weep. And it's screening this month, and you can view it online during this premiere time. And I watched this film with a few people yesterday, and it is telling various stories from Israel-Palestine. And one of the trauma healing teachers who is part of this documentary, and the weaving in of these teachers and counselors and practitioners with the stories of people and their lived experience, they said something to the effect of human beings have 3 inbuilt responses to crisis. We ask for help. And if the places or the people to whom we reach out for help are unable to offer the support that we need, we then go into 2 primary responses, which we've all heard, right? Fight or flight. You either run away or you get big and aggressive. And then I think what struck me about this was, so he said, now, if neither one of those is fitting for the situation that you find yourself in, your body will actually freeze. And this is a superpower that we have, because if the pain cannot be avoided by any means that is accessible, the best thing our body can do for us is to help to temporarily disconnect us from the pain. And so we freeze, we dissociate, we like we shut down in a way. And I think the part of this that I found compelling was, I've always heard these spoken of side by side. So you fight, you flee, or you freeze, or you fawn, like side by side, as if we're accessing them all. And it was the first time I had heard someone talk about the frozenness of trauma response as a last resort. It is not one among many first choices. It's a last resort. And when Thomas Hübl, who I first heard say that phrase, freedom is the ability to respond in a fitting way. He was talking about how when we seek individually and collectively to grapple with trauma wounding, it's like encountering permafrost. And he says, if we try to melt it all at once, it doesn't turn out well. I'm thinking it's not permafrost exactly, but we had a few years ago here where I live in the Walla Walla Valley, a devastating flood. It got too warm in the mountains and too much of the ice melted at one time. And so he'll say that we carry this wounding, this frozenness. And when we engage in the work of healing, individually and collectively, what we're doing is creating a container in which that permafrost can thaw in ways that are gradual enough that as it thaws, it can be integrated. So I'm imagining water running down, and maybe the land or our communities or our nervous system capacity can actually receive and allow to soak in that little bit that's melting. If it all melts at once, it's overwhelming. And it sends us straight back where we started from, where we look for help. If it's not available, we either flee or we fight. And if that doesn't work out, we freeze. So when I think of what trauma studies brings to the question of how might we talk about freedom as the ability to respond in appropriate ways to the people and the settings that are in front of us, I think what it offers is language to move away from the way that we hear freedom talked about in many American and maybe white nationalist, but also conservative Christian settings, where freedom is the right to say whatever you want to say because you believe it, even if you're being told it's hurting other people to behave or to speak in the way that you are. That the individual right to air whatever you're needing to air for your momentary comfort is more important than the collective well-being. And I think what trauma studies invites us to ask is not only the question of appropriateness, that just because we can doesn't mean it's appropriate. It also invites us to ask, what is the capacity of the space or the situation or the people involved in the situation that you're thinking of, right? What does freedom look like in this situation? And it invites us to take our time, to not try to heal all at once, and to be, I suppose, resourced in the sense that when Thomas Hübl talks about, melting the permafrost layer by layer in a way that where we hold collective space for one another, he's basically asking us to hold that space for one another to be able to integrate that layer that is melting off. And so The other piece of this, and part of the reason why I feel like this documentary that I just watched yesterday is so helpful in some of these regards, is that these conversations have to talk about trauma wounding all around, the people who are, are being crushed by the thumb of the oppressors, and the oppressors themselves are all wounded. And this film talked about that wounding and how. And so for me, I think the trauma studies lens allows me to see that when we react out of our wounding, we inevitably cause more harm. Parker Palmer, he spoke about this on Being once. And he basically, I wish I had pulled up his words before presenting, because he says it better than I can say it now. I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially said, we then can come to where we have a choice between our heart breaking and becoming all these like shards of glass that if anyone encounters it, they cut themselves. Or we can allow, he says, our heart to be broken open, and in that breaking open to hold space for grief and joy, for the full range of human experience, including the wounding. So I appreciate that part of trauma studies, both because it allows me to say that sometimes we wound each other because we literally don't have a choice. I mean, Lauren, you're teasing me about, do we even have freedom? And the reality is no, right? 80% or more of what we do is subconscious. We react based on all kinds of stimuli. But thinking of the way in which we can acknowledge that, and we can also take responsibility for carefully and intentionally creating space for, that those layers of wounding to melt in fitting settings so that healing can take place. I think it can be helpful. I have two quotes that I would like to read here. Maybe I'll type them into the chat. Again, since I know some people like to be able to see something written out, sometimes it's hard to hear it. One is from Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth said, life is a hard battle anyway. If we laugh and sing a little as we fight the good fight of freedom, it makes it all go easier. I will not allow my life's light to be determined by the darkness around me. And I think I mentioned in the little blurb, kind of trying to introduce what I wanted to explore today, I mentioned the quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel, which I'll read more of it later, but I've never forgotten how he, as philosopher and Hebrew Bible scholar, said that the opposite of freedom is not determinism, it's hardness of heart. So this idea that allowing our life's light to not be crushed by the darkness doesn't mean not admitting the darkness is there. And then James Baldwin, so many gems of wisdom from him, but he says, it has now been laid to my charge to keep my own heart free of hatred and despair. And so the idea that as we heal, we actually free ourselves to engage with each other in different ways. The other lens that I think it can be helpful is the developmental psychology or attachment theory lens. And I guess the standard image for this, is the initial research that was done in attachment theory, where researchers would bring primary caregivers and very, very young children into the lab and observe their behavior. And they documented a lot of the patterns that unfold there, patterns of relating. And I think the piece that feels relevant to this freedom as the ability to respond, the capacity to respond, is that in a secure attachment relationship, what people observe is that the the caregiver is present, but almost providing as appropriate, ever expanding concentric circles of space for exploration. So if you imagine throwing a stone into a pond, and we all have seen the circles expand, and as a child develops in their early years, right, from infant to toddler, that circle expands. So initially the child is like held by the caregiver right here, right? And as the child develops in that, even the first few months of childhood for us as humans is called the fourth trimester, right? In a way, the mother is still holding the child. And then as the child develops, the primary caregiver, if they are able to relate in a responsive way, provides enough space that the child is able to explore in appropriately widening circles, fitting to their development, the place of their development. And in that exploration, the safety does not come from never being hurt. The safety does not come from never cutting yourself, never being surprised by anything, never experiencing, despair. The safety comes from the security of knowing that as I explore, I can turn back and I can connect with my primary caregiver, and they are going to be there. And they provide this sort of anchor point for my exploration. They provide a foundation that allows me to take risks, even when the cost of that is that I will experience discomfort, pain. And so attachment theory provides this framework for understanding human relating as we grow over time to be our own person in the world. And ideally, that happens in relationship to others, that relationship not being, that relationship not meaning essentially that you will never, how to say this? It's not that you'll never feel disconnected. I think the piece of it that is significant to me is that in attachment theory, when they trace it over the course of a lifetime and you come to really significant moments, one of them is adolescence, the task of that period of life is to recognize that you can experience discomfort and conflict and deep confusion. And it does not necessarily have to mean that you have to, that relational container is at risk. Okay, so ideally in adolescence, we experience over time, gradually, having conflict, having a clash with people in our lives who either see something different, want something different, have different personalities, etc. Having that clash, showing up fully, have the other person show up fully, and recognize that we can grow into the people that we are and not lose that primary relationship, not lose that relational container. And in one way or another, that is important throughout our lives. And so to me, attachment theory brings to this question of how do we think about freedom as the ability to respond appropriately? It brings to that question two things. One is that there is no absolute right or wrong in the sense that, you don't look at an infant who is looking back at its mother as it crawls across the floor to decide how far out it wants to go. We don't look at that infant and say like, oh, how inept of you, to need to reassure yourself that your caregiver is there. It's developmentally appropriate. And you could say that there are developmentally appropriate places to be all along the growth journey. And so attachment theory to me gives it moves away from saying like, this is freedom, it's always going to look this way. And it invites the question, what is developmentally appropriate? What is the appropriate level of maturity for this person or this situation or this institution look like? There's no one size fits all. I'm noticing a question in the chat. Is there a secure or insecure attachment between the child and the primary caregiver? So I think when I say secure attachment, I'm meaning the sense where the caregiver does not promise absolute comfort and no pain. The caregiver offers presence. So the child can explore, and it's considered a secure attachment if the child looks back toward the parent to check in and then continues exploring. If the parent leaves the room, it's considered, and the child is upset, that's considered secure attachment. And if when the parent returns, they can soothe the child, that's considered secure attachment. So it's the combination of experiencing the full range of human experience, with which children are they do naturally. We're made to engage in that way. But to be able to do that without your support being threatened, that relationship remains, that would be secure. And for those of us who carry attachment wounding, then we received messages early on that was not going to be available to us consistently. And so then our protective mechanisms that we developed as children carry with us into adult life. And we can move into a secure way of being, but for most of us, if there's crisis or fear or uncertainty, we go right back to that whatever pattern that helped us survive childhood. So attachment theory to me asks this question of what is appropriate for the setting, for the level of maturity, for the situation, and is there enough flexibility that there is exploration and risk-taking that's possible within a container of a relational container that is sustainable. I'm engaging with philosophy, not because I'm a philosopher, but because I want to present about this at the philosophy conference coming up in the fall. And so I have found some of Martha Nussbaum's work really helpful in this regard. And I want to read, let's see how much time we have. Maybe I'll read a couple of things. I think of Martha Nussbaum as a really, really helpful in thinking about like responsible human living in conversation with political science and maybe values ethics, and also political philosophy. So she is credited as writing about education, and I'll read this, and I'll also copy this into the chat because it's kind of long, and you might want to look at it typed out. She says, an education is truly fitted for freedom only if it is such as to produce free citizens who are not free because of wealth or birth, but because they can call their minds their own. Male and female, slave-born and free-born, rich and poor, they have looked into themselves and developed the ability to separate mere habit and convention from what they can defend by argument. They have ownership of their own thought and speech, and this imparts to them a dignity that is far beyond the outer dignity of class and rank. And so she explores in various ways in her work what it looks like to talk about freedom in the human experience in a way that could be compatible with a responsible citizenship, I guess you could say, or intentional citizenship. And she has an essay in her book, Political Emotions, Why Love Matters for Justice. She has an essay about in what ways, it's kind of like the strengths and liabilities of patriotism, I guess you could say. And one of the things that that she says is incredibly important for us to do as we educate our children. And I guess we could extend that to as we hold space for one another. She says, use positional imagination in a way that includes difference. So when I think of her talking about education, I think of this use of conversation, of educational, power that comes from position, whatever it is. I think of it allowing for the risk taking that is inherent in daring to imagine something, and to do that collectively. And I want to also point out earlier in the essay, she points out a section of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, but kind of a section that I guess she says is not as widely quoted. And I think that I'll just read this because it felt helpful to me in reflecting on what is freedom, if we're thinking about this from the lens of political philosophy. So this is quoting from Martin Luther King Jr. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. I'm going to read the another question in the chat. Is the failure of a child to achieve freedom expressed by being by nature shy or introverted as outward signs of the inward lack of dignity? Yeah, I would say not necessarily. It might be multiple factors. And I see David responded a little bit to this. I think of it more as, I think the type of freedom that I'm talking about is the freedom that allows curiosity about what is appropriate. So if someone is introverted by nature and they get energized by being alone or with small groups, then the fact that they can't behave proudly and outwardly and, in a performance way, like someone who is energized by groups of people, really it doesn't say anything about their developmental wounding or lack thereof. I think when I think of freedom as the ability to respond, I'm thinking not only of it as the ability to respond to the outward situation or stimuli, I'm thinking of it also as the ability to be honest about our own strengths and limitations, and to be comfortable with what is, that what we can offer is not all the same, and to have a sense of maybe as we become more and more able to respond, right, instead of react, maybe to hold space for what is without feeling that pressure. Again, going back to the trauma teachers, many of them will say, if we're saying should, or if we're saying I still react this way, I haven't been able to do it without yet, they're saying that's okay. Pause right there. The freedom that we're talking about is a freedom to be with what is. And in so doing, to hear, to see what is and not what you wish it was there. You open the way for this responsiveness, this capacity for responsiveness to expand. So going to the next sentence in that quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel, Heschel wrote, "The opposite of freedom is not determinism, but hardness of heart. Freedom presupposes openness of heart, of mind, of eye, and ear." And this feels particularly relevant because I think in many cases I have heard freedom referenced casually and perhaps carelessly as like freedom as the opposite of control. So let's say that I have been deeply hurt by a family or institution or relationship that sought to control or manipulate to the point where it's abusive. Okay, let's say, and so many times we talk about freedom as getting away from that. But I feel like what Heschel is saying is that it's not so much a contrast between everything is controlled, right? Determined, like there's no agency at all, right? No nuance, no ability to inform or impact a situation or person. It's not so much that being the opposite of freedom, but it is the hardness of heart. So for humans, I guess, yeah, freedom can mean a softness of heart, an ability to openly see what is, to hear what is, to be fully present with people who hold differing opinions and have different experiences. And yeah, I would say, Ray, you're absolutely, you're probably onto something. I don't know exactly what you're referencing when you say conservative environment, but I know that I think when I think of fundamentalism, I often think of the lack of capacity to be present with a different belief or practice than your own, and that shows up everywhere. You can be a fundamentalist atheist, you can be a fundamentalist Christian, you can be a fundamentalist pretty much anything, but I would say that the type of freedom that I'm talking about is frowned upon in fundamentalist settings. Yeah. So a couple more things, and then I'll put these images up on the. Maybe I'll just share that. I never know whether to share my own writing or not, but I think I'm going to put into the chat a link to a blog I wrote it's from like a year or a year and a half ago, I think. I don't know when it's from, but kind of looking at some of this seeing and hearing things, but Hebrew, it's so interesting to ask myself about Hebrew words because they are rich with meaning. And I would say the Hebrew word for freedom is not one that, I mean, it's not one that is used a huge amount in the Hebrew Bible narrative, but I did run across a Jewish author who wrote about the word chofesh, and talked about this as freedom in the sense of being free from coercion. And I think the piece of this that I want to be curious about today is that if we say that our reactions, our behaviors, our choices are 80% unconscious, right? So we are not consciously choosing. We are acting out of the stories that we carry in our body, the signals that we've picked up from our cultures, all kinds of things. Then we can really talk about freedom as freedom from external coercion, in the sense of, literally not being given the ability to walk from your house to your field, like people experience in Palestine. A wall goes up and they can no longer walk from their house to the orchard that their family depends on for survival. That, you can think of that, right? So that is a physical, like, block. But we have the wounds that we carry both individually and collectively, and even the legacies, that the trauma legacies that we carry intergenerationally, so down, passing down through multiple generations. They can, I think, manifest as coercion, because we are literally not in a place to be able to react differently until we engage in some work of healing. And the other Hebrew word, I love the Hebrew word bain. I guess as in the form of being, we might say it's a verb that means to discern, to have understanding. But I love Hebrew because, well, for two reasons. I love it because it's so image driven, but in this case, I love it because the same combos of letters can carry multiple connotations. And I suppose the piece of this that I am finding valuable is the idea that, so in Hebrew, there's the verb, right, that we can discern or like decide between, understand, have deepening understanding. But there's also a preposition, bain, that just means between. And I love this sense that freedom is not knowing between this and this one is always right. Right? That's the type of certainty that we long for in times of chaos and crisis. We long for absolutes, like this will always lead to this. This will always be the appropriate response. But freedom, if you think of this being, right? If we gain understanding, we gain discernment that is an active, unfolding, dynamic process, and it helps us to discern between multiple options and select which one is appropriate for the situation or setting or person in front of us. And so for me, this allows me to move somewhat back from this idea of I just need to figure out the right one out of these two options. And it moves me into a space of curiosity of what would each of these options offer, and in what way would it be fitting or not fitting to the situation. And in the Hebrew Bible, humanity is invited into that ongoing conversation. Humanity is invited into that ongoing conversation. And sometimes it's very explicit. I know the example is overused, but in the book of Proverbs, sometimes the proverbs are set right next to each other that say opposite things. And so it becomes very obvious that what the wisdom teachers were wanting from us was to invite us to decide, right? In what case is it appropriate to answer the fool according to his folly? And in what case is it not appropriate to answer the fool according to his folly? That's why the biblical collectors put those side by side to give us that permission as receivers of this sacred tradition, that we get to participate in that ongoing dialogue of what is appropriate or fitting. And then there's many ways that it's present in the Hebrew Bible in much broader ways. There are many explanations of reality, of crisis, of pain, that seem mutually contradictory, but the Hebrew Bible holds space for them all. And I read that as an invitation to kind of join those voices and ask, right, what parts of each of these explanations is appropriate for various settings. So I will, and maybe I'm going to just read this. This also came up in the documentary I watched also, but the idea that freedom can be completely individual is nonsense. And I'm saying that with confidence because I have run across statements to that regard from so many people that I hold in high regard that I'm feeling more confident all the time saying it. The documentary I watched last night basically, said the equivalent of you are not free until everyone is free. And Rabbi Danya Rutenberg says your liberation will not come at the expense of someone else's liberation. It does not happen that way. You may get temporary power or domination, but it will always be insecure, fragile. It will not be liberation, not until your work and freedom is intertwined with everyone's. So I'm gonna share now my PowerPoint picture and invite anybody, maybe if you want to put in the chat or if you want to just raise your hand and say something about any of these images and which one is meaningful to you. I have my own interpretations of what all these images mean because I picked them and put them on the PowerPoint slide. But what aspects of these images or even others that I haven't included here feel relevant to you as far as grappling with freedom as the ability to respond appropriately or in fitting ways, in spirit-led ways? And Lauren, I see your hand is up, so take it away.
Something that's been running through my mind. This is a very intense political season here in the United States. And I don't want to get into politics necessarily, but I will say this, Jody, the American ethos is you can do anything.
Yeah.
And I remember actually being told that by people as I was growing up, saying, oh, here in America, the guy who sweeps the streets can become the president of the United States. And that kind of rags to riches story, that whole Horatio Alger sort of sense, that was, it almost didn't need to be said, Jody. It was sort of part of
the water we swim in.
It just came with the background. And to a certain extent, Seventh-day Adventism pushed me in that direction. I came from a blue-collar family, as did several of my friends here who I know. Both Art Clem and I grew up on farms. We both went on, got advanced degrees, and Adventism helped with that. There was a social lift in all of that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, to say you have absolute freedom to be whatever you want to be is pretty much utter nonsense.
It is.
I do not have the freedom to be a great basketball player. Mm-hmm. I have neither the skills for it, nor the physicality for it, nor the eye for it, nor the height for it. And a lot of people who, somebody quoted this to me recently. I've heard it. It's an old phrase, but it said he was born on third base and he thought he hit a home run.
Yeah.
A lot of things that we think we are free to achieve.
Yeah.
Really hard example. I guess to say it in another way, those really aren't examples of freedom. Mm-hmm. As such. There's the ability to do your understanding of freedom as doing something significant and useful beyond just doing whatever you want. but making a difference and taking into account everybody else's freedom. That even there, Jody, I suspect the ability to choose some of these things is the how do I say it? The space for choice is fairly small for a
Yeah.
lot of us.
And don't you think, I'm just thinking so many times when I would call that, toxic positivity or prosperity preaching or whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
but it's often used in really, really dehumanizing ways. Like, in other words, someone who was born on third base says to me, oh, if you just practice hard enough, you will be the next, like, Itzhak Perlman, right? Well,
Exactly.
okay, that's really, really harmful to say to people. But at the same time, I think when I think of this phrase as freedom as the ability to respond, what I'm hoping to invite people into is an honesty with what is in the presence of other people, so that there is that safety for exploration in a way that you can be responsive to whatever you do have. Um, I mean, think how incredibly moving it is to see the stories of people who face tremendous limitations due to disabilities, and to catch a glimpse of the richness of life and contribution, despite the fact that it looks different than what we might consider, normal. And perhaps that is part of this invitation all the way around, that the invitation is to pay attention and be attentive to and be responsive to the interests that bubble up in us. I mean, why was it just this year that I finally realized the verse in the Psalms that says, what is it? Trust in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart, or something
Yeah.
like that. I
Yeah.
spent
Yeah.
my entire life thinking that that meant I needed to abandon myself so that in the end, God could give me the desires of my heart. And I am 41 years old now. And it was in the last 6 months that someone said that verse. I have all of these amazing aha moments when I hear scripture said in the presence of other people. Someone said that verse, and suddenly, for the first time ever, it landed as, you notice those desires that bubble up in your heart? Those are gifts from God. Your invitation is to be responsive to them, to pay attention to them, to cultivate, to lean into them.
And yet, if you put that, Jody, in terms of achievement, as the American way is to talk about these things in terms of achievement, um,
Yeah.
you can become this thing. You can become the multimillionaire. Look at Thomas Edison and where he started. I mean, this is so, if you put it in those terms, it leaves all
Yeah.
of us feeling like failures.
Yeah.
I've often, I told somebody one day, I don't know that I've ever set out to have an actual plan for my life that took me anywhere. I just sort of made a few decisions along the way that were presented to me, and this is where I landed. But
Yep.
this whole thing of, man, I grabbed my own bootstraps, folks, and I pulled hard and I lifted, and look where I am now. I wonder how many people can honestly say that they did that. I don't think very many. The
I
free,
think again, though, I think again, the invitation is to hold space for it all. Like, I had a student in my office this week who was telling me about how incredibly confusing it is to be at a point in life where they are not clear at all on what is next for them. And they said, oh yeah, okay, they're telling me the story. This person, knew at the age of 15 that they were going to study whatever they were going to study, and they went to college and they took it, and then they got a job and they stayed in that job for 45 years,
and,
and
and
he's like, yeah, I have this.
felt very rewarded for it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that is true for some people. Some people come into life in a way where they know early on, this is what I want to do, and it's just there, and it's part, and they're able to pursue it, and it just happens. And then, I spent we're selective in this regard, because I changed career recently, and moving out of the field of theology, I felt tremendous judgment because the way that I always heard people talk about this was that if the calling was real, it should last for your whole life.
Exactly.
So me deciding that I want to change my career and I want to move into trauma studies and Hebrew Bible interdisciplinary work, and I want to be trained as a clinician, you know what I mean? Like, is kind of evidence that, like, see, Jody's calling was never real in the first place. She was just pretending. And yet, why, right? If I were to give up on that tug that has been in my heart my whole life to be trained as a clinician, then I would be giving up on some of what God has given me to bring into my spaces in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fine with me if my next door neighbor knew at age 5 that they wanted to be a social worker and they came and they're a social worker, and that's fine, right? That's all great. But I think the invitation is to not ever use our experience as a measure for others' experiences.
It's only in my relatively old age that I've been able to even admit that the call that I thought God gave me probably didn't turn out to be all that satisfying in what I was asked to do. And I hate to be able to, I hate to have to say that, it's this time of, but there's a certain freedom and joy in being able to say, yeah, I'm not sure that really worked out all that well, God.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah, I want to. Oh, go ahead.
No, Dr. Washburn.
I wanted to just mention the question from Arthur in the chat. Have we already mentioned how genetics relates to freedom? I mean, the only thing that I mentioned is generational trauma. If anybody wants to read about that, there are great books about it. Some of them more academic. There's a popularly written book that you can pick up and read in like a day, and it's called Emotional Inheritance, and it's a therapist that tells stories of her clients and how she saw that. But and that's only right. I'm talking about intergenerational trauma legacies. But it plays out in so many ways. And I think genetics is there's overlap, but there's a whole other field there that I don't know anything about.
Well, thank you. And before I come to Jerry, Dr. Washburn, just a thought that occurs to me. A few years ago, there was a very popular book that I think ultimately was maybe made into a movie entitled The Life of Pi by Jan Martel. And if you have not read it, part of the premise was it had to do with animals that are captive in a zoo, and how many people look at that and say, well, that's terrible. These animals have been deprived of their freedom to, race across the desert or the jungle or, whatever. But the opposite side of that viewpoint is that, well, it's a relative consideration, because while that may be true, they have gained the freedom from predators. They've gained freedom from paucity in the sense of not having enough food. They've gained security and other things. And so the whole notion of freedom is somewhat dependent upon the lens through which one is considering it. And I suspect I mention it because from a theological or a religious standpoint, don't you suspect that there are many people that are comfortable with 28 or even more fundamental beliefs because it establishes a rope, it establishes parameters, borders. For someone, I'm an old elementary school counselor, and the idea that children do not want their parents to set barriers is nonsense. Barriers create comfortability and security for young children. Unfortunately, for people who have not achieved a very high level of spiritual development, that still exists. Would you not agree?
Yeah, and I would say, like, this is observable at a like, would it be called macro, like big picture, global level? Like, I'm thinking of sociologist of religion, Peter Berger. He was famous for his secularization hypothesis. After such and such amount of years, society is going to move to less of a religious framework for making sense of reality and what it means to live a fulfilling, meaningful life. And he basically, like, toward the end of his career, or maybe after retirement, I don't remember when he wrote this essay, but he he recanted that. And when he explained himself, he said, yes, I have been proven wrong. He said, fundamentalism is rising around the world. And he said, I make sense of this in part by admitting that we as humans, we want predictability and certainty. And because of the level of change that we are facing, there's climate, ecological crisis change, there's technology change that is unfolding at a rate that is outpacing what our nervous system development can keep up with. And so because of that, we are en masse as humans signing up for fundamentalist religions again, because it provides at least a temporary sense of safety and predictability. And like you said, right, like the fence, the boundary within which a child can feel safe.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. Jerry, my friend, good to see you. What's on your mind today?
Thank you. Good to see you, Linda. I'm thinking back to some examples that perhaps you might have encouraged in me. Freedom, Jody, as you posited it, it's an opportunity to act. Now you can choose to freeze, you can choose to do something stringent about it, or you can choose to run like hell. But you can do something. I think that we all possess freedom in that sense. And I'm thinking that the challenge of freedom isn't to learn to run faster necessarily, although it might be appropriate at times. The strength of freedom comes when you feel that you can do the right thing for the right reason at the right time.
Yep.
And I think back on opportunities that I have had in my career as a family doctor to simply take a person by the hand and look them in the eye and say, I think you can do this. Can we work on this together? To say to a resident, come, sit with me in the lounge, the physician's lounge, because you're a physician now. Now let's think this through and think what we can do that will make the situation better and act like a doctor and have the freedom to be the doctor. I envy my great friend Art Clem in his ability now in his late stages of career to act as a judicial determinant. He has the opportunity to do the right thing with the imprimatur of the state over his signature. I think each and every one of us has the opportunity to be free to smile at the person on the sidewalk who's barely in their right mind, lying on the streets of Boston, as I saw at a meeting I was at a week ago, to smile at a person you pass on the sidewalk, not just look down and hurry by. Those are humanistic determinants of favor. And I think those people aren't the same after I've given them those things.
And I love the collaborative. I think to me, freedom as in, cultivating a capacity to respond appropriately. I think to me that collaborative element is really, really important, because whoever we're with, whether it's a resident and a supervising physician, or if it's two people walking down the street, that we're going to be walking through life with people who have different skill sets and different perspectives and different stories, different nervous system training, different attachment styles. And the opportunity is to recognize, I think, and again, I've faced tremendous pushback when I say things like this, but like I have found in my personal experience that whenever I seek to offer presence or support to another human, I am the interaction that relational space that we co-create. I am transformed by what they bring to that space. And you could say, okay, well, but that poor person, they had nothing, right? Well, fine. But what do we gain by saying that? What do we gain by comparing and ranking? Because to me, it makes no difference who it is. that I have found in every human interaction, the collaborative potential to find a thread of healing, right? To offer it and to receive it.
Agreed. And to hope that they will go on and do the same with another person.
Yep,
And
exactly.
so on. And then you have this fission, this uncontrollable reaction of goodness and goodwill emanating from one free act.
Yep.
Let's do it.
Yep. And you get rid of you get rid of, I love how Jonathan Sachs talks about this. I mean, I bring up his essay in pretty much every presentation that I make, but he wrote a beautiful essay on the concept of chesed, or, covenant love in the Hebrew Bible. It's called Love as Deed, I think. It's in his book, To Heal a Fractured World. And he's written about this in many other places also, but basically the difference between state and economy, where, there's a bounded amount of money and we have to divide it. And if I get more, you get less. And there's a bounded amount of power and we have to divide it. And if I get more, you get less. And he says love and dignity and care and respect, they're abundant resources. The more you give, the more you have. And so you lose this need to, like, I gave you $20 when you were down and out, and I'm waiting here until you give me exactly $20 the instant you have the capacity to do so, because it's only worthwhile if it's exact, right? What we give each other is exactly comparable, and you can release that and then be part of this big ebb and flow of, like, sometimes I need a lot of care and have very little to offer. And I receive that. And then sometimes I have a lot to offer and I can freely give with no need to compare or measure. Yeah.
Go. Good. Love it.
Well, and Jerry, wouldn't you say that text Ephesians 2:10, that God has planned these things for us, these opportunities to we just have to watch for them. We have to be alert to them.
Pay attention.
Right. And accept them as God's will. Don't just look at them as happenstance.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. The gentleman from Sweden, I apologize that I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Is it Timo?
That's really okay.
Okay. That really means no, I didn't get it right, but he's a kind man. Please bring your thoughts to the.
Thank you so much for a very nice and important presentation, a very, very deep presentation. So I want to share my childhood story that I think will fit in this story. And it was 65 years ago. I was 6 years old, and Mom wake us up 4 o'clock in the morning. Our house was in fire, so we were trapped on the second floor, and smoke came against us, and we couldn't go downstairs. And we had this second stairs, and there was fire coming to us. And finally, Mother could open the balcony door. And the interesting thing is that this has never been a trauma for me or a crisis, because I really trusted Mom. Mom will fix it. So I was not really scared. So that is something I would like to say. And by the way, it was interesting because my mother always told us that was an angel that woke her up. An angel, someone hit her 4 o'clock in the morning. And it was really late, because 5 minutes later, when we had left the house, nobody could come near the house. So I have told this because I think that this was not a crisis for me, because I trusted Mom, even it was a dangerous situation.
Yep.
And by the way, I think I like most the bird that you let go flying. And as a parent, I think it's very difficult to know, how do I know that my child, when they are very young, can manage to fly? How do I know that? I have to trust them in a way, because the opposite is worse.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Ray and Bobby, let me get you guys to unmute. Hang on.
I'm unmuted.
Oh, good. All right, good. All right. Yay. All right. It's good to see you guys.
Really enjoyed this talk that Jody gave. It raised a lot of thoughts. One of them was that if this had been talked about or discussed many years ago, I think it would have been called humanism.
Mm.
People would have said, she's too humanistic there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are humans, aren't we?
Yep. And God made us.
Yes.
And so along those lines, I got to thinking, if we believe that we're made or designed in the image of God and given freedom, this freedom of choice, I like the way you said freedom but to make the correct choices,
Mm-hmm.
that it seems like our religious emphasis could have been due to the times that it came about, the beginning, went the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing freedom for people, we went into the mode of the opposite. We went into this fight or flight mode. And that's been
Mm-hmm.
our emphasis ever since. And I think of the educational system, your proposal to think about freedom and have this freedom of choice in the appropriate ways, I was never taught that. It was
Yeah.
never even brought up.
Yep.
In fact, freedom was, I don't want to totally trash everything I was brought up on, but freedom was only allowed in a very narrow path.
Mm-hmm.
You had the freedom to think and act in a particular way as long as you stayed in that narrow path.
Yeah.
And that's not a real freedom at all. So if God created us to have freedom of thought, and people will point to the Bible and say, oh, well, it says this and that. I think to me, I look at the Bible as, okay, I'm going to give you some ideas of what to do with your freedom. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
give you some ideas of what's the wrong way to go and the right way to go. In other words, responsibility. So I think
Yeah.
if you took the Bible and looked at it as, here's some stories about correct and incorrect ways of expressing your freedom,
Mm-hmm.
we would be a group of different people today. We might not even have these discussions because we would have discovered long ago that we are a free people.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Somehow it just seems like I can't get away from the idea that conservatism is the opposite of freedom.
Yeah.
Now I know that's narrowly defining it, but still, I really enjoy the way you're putting this freedom choice today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And some of your words make me think of maybe I'm going to betray now the type of reading that I'm interested in, but I'm reading a book by a Jungian analyst called The Vital Spark. And she's basically making an argument using all kinds of elements from various stories and mythology. She's making the argument that the purpose of human growth is like that maturity basically involves, and she lists all of these things that she calls the outlaw energies. So things like shrewdness, rage, things that like disagreeableness, things that for many, and she's writing specifically to women, but I really think it applies to humanity in general because we all receive these messages in one way or another. But she writes about how we get the message early on that if that we aren't allowed to have certain of these experiences. And she says the goal is not to come to a point where you can rage unlimited. You know, you can be miserly and like conniving everywhere you go, to be disagreeable just because you can. The purpose is to gain a sense that within the range of human experience, there is a moment to be a raging mama bear. And there is a moment to set a boundary. And there is a moment to let someone know how their behavior affects you. And that the purpose is not to freely engage in all of these outlaw things suddenly, but the purpose is to that we have experiences that allow us to know deep down that that aspect of human experience is accessible to me. So that if I find myself in a situation where I need to access that capacity for disagreeableness, I haven't been so like steeped only in my favorite trauma response is fawning, right? I'm really good at being completely dissociated and like smiling and nodding and making the powerful white men around me feel good about themselves. So like, that's my automatic like response, okay? And she's saying the purpose is not that every time I have one of these interactions, I just rage, right? And then tell them, give them a piece of my mind. The purpose is that I would be able, when appropriate, in the appropriate measure, to access shrewdness, to access disagreeableness, to access rage. Not that they take over, not that I just freely express every single thing that crosses my, screen or whatever you want to call it. So as you were talking, it made me think of that book, that the purpose is to diversify what we have, the capacities and resources that we have access to as we walk this path of discernment, right? Understanding the appropriate or fitting way of being with different people in different situations, different seasons of life.
That's a very civilized way of looking at it. It brings to mind probably the other side of that coin, Dr. Washburn, when you sit there and make all those powerful men feel good, are the words from the old 60s song, Bobby McGee, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose.
Yeah.
And because you have things to lose, potentially, if you were to then you somehow suddenly gain the ability to redirect what might have been your desired behavior at that moment.
Oh, absolutely. I pat myself on the back and I say, thank you, precious body. You have helped me survive dangerous situations.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Thanks, Ray. I think we all puzzle over it just like you do. Lauren, I'm going to come to David first, and then I'll come back to you. David, welcome. I've seen you put some things in the chat. What are you puzzling over?
Yeah, this is brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to be reaching out to you. I did my master's thesis. It was titled Freedom is Responsibility, and took up a lot of these themes.
Get out of here. Are you serious?
Yeah. And I now work in trauma. So this is absolutely fascinating. I think I'm just going to pick up on that last discussion, that last thing we were talking about there. It's interesting to me that in reading this way, where, the outlaw energies, we ignore that in Scripture. You look at Scripture, and what do you do with David, who was a man of violence? What do you do with the centurion that Jesus encounters? And Jesus says, this guy has faith. And we don't talk about this. I think there's this fascinating aspect around that. I started doing martial arts like 15 years ago now, 14 or 15 years. And it's interesting, learning violence has taught me more about nonviolence than I ever could have imagined. And it has prepared me to be nonviolent in ways I could not have comprehended before then. And I think that's part of what's fascinating to me, is when we reduce things to this rigid, like, this is what you need to do to be free, this is what you need to do to be good, it actually inhibits our ability to be good. It inhibits our ability to respond. And
we become two-dimensional. We lose our three-dimension, we lose full color, right? It flattens our experience.
Yeah. So it's absolutely fascinating. So I don't have a big question, but I will be reaching out, and thank you so much.
I would love to. I want to read your thesis now.
I can link you that.
Thanks. You.
Thank you, David. So Lauren, give us you need to unmute yourself and tell us what additional thoughts you have.
Well, actually, this is a thought that I just borrowed from my friend Art Clem in the chat, and he asked, or less, I'm putting in my own words, if we brought up the topics that you brought up today to a group of people in, let's say, Gaza right now, what kind of discussion would people be having on the notion of freedom in a place where destruction reigns from the skies, and there seems to be no expression of human kindness anywhere? How is this a discussion that we can only be having in a space of relative peace, where we can sit around and talk about how we weren't quite fulfilled in life and things like that, as opposed to a place where people are being just treated with sheer cruelty constantly?
Mm-hmm.
You brought up trauma early on, and I wasn't quite sure how you were connecting it all. So I'm giving you a chance here to talk about that.
And Lauren, I'm gonna stack onto your question a little bit, because whenever I have to moderate, I try and put down one question that I can ask, and it feeds right into this, and maybe enlarges it somewhat. Dr. Washburn, I don't, in light of the same issue that Lauren has brought up, I don't know if you were aware, perhaps you are, of who Tom Friedman is. He's an economist who writes for the New York Times. And I didn't see the piece myself, but he wrote a piece, apparently, some months ago, having to do with this conflict now ongoing between Israel and Palestine. And Dr. Friedman is Jewish, but what he said, that because I wrote down myself Sachs' quote, that you become co-authors with God and, of a just and gracious social order. And I thought, that's just pretty words. That's kind of what Lauren is saying to me. Where's the reality here? And what Dr. Friedman said that the Israelis should have done in response to that terrible attack from Hamas is that they should have said, "We forgive you."
Mm-hmm.
And that be it.
Mm-hmm.
But think of what kind of freedom one has to envision for oneself to be able to do that. Think about the barriers to that have created the situation that Lauren is talking about. So how does that fit in? Intergenerational trauma, as you talk about it, this is the hot spot for that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that this conversation, right? The fact that we gather here, we're safe. I had my coffee this morning, and it's a little warm in my room, but I certainly am not lacking anything that I need, right? So we are engaging in this conversation from a tremendous place of privilege, and I think that the birth lottery, to me, is a grief that I think we have to carry our whole lives. It makes no sense whatsoever why I was born where I was. So that feels like an ongoing grief, and very important to name the fact that it's certainly nothing of my own merit that makes it so that I randomly show up in a safe place and someone else is born in Gaza. And I can't really speak, although Lauren, the hair on the back of my neck stood up a little bit with one thing you said, and I don't remember the words now. Too much time has passed, but I think it's important for us to remember, and this is partly why I put this image here of the tiny little plants coming up through the cracks in the plaster. It is important to remember the incredible strength and resilience of the human spirit. And it's been really important for me. I think that's why I would recommend, if anyone is able, to go watch that documentary that's screening right now, where olive trees weep, because you get this picture of people who do not need our rescue. They need us to admit our own complicity in the violence that they're experiencing and to make choices in that regard for ourselves, but they do not need our rescue. There are people there who experience trauma at such a deep level that they couldn't shed a tear for 25 solid years. And yet they testify that they are able in one way or another to have almost containers in their lives. So they have containers of laughter and joy and creativity, while there's also the container of really, I live in a place where I have no options. I have no options. My water's being taken away. My house is being destroyed, right? But that doesn't mean that they are not living a meaningful life and accessing tremendous resilience. And so that documentary holds space for sitting with that, both and another book that I read this year that did that for me also. It's called, what is it called? Palestinian Walks, maybe. It's by a lawyer who was trained outside of Israel and then went back and has spent his whole career in Israel. And yeah, he opens the reader's eyes to see what it's like to have a dream and have it not be possible. So he's trained as a lawyer. He is highly skilled at what he does. And he's operating within this machine that systematically takes property illegally away from people who have lived on the land for hundreds of years. And he's very open about the way that lands in his body. It's painful. It's debilitating sometimes. And yet he tells the story of walking through the land, of somehow through it all, maintaining a connection to his own body, to the stories of his ancestors, to his family, to friends, to the like reverence and awe toward the human spirit, while being honest that he's operating within a system that is really, really, really corrupt and broken. And so I think we can listen to the voices of these folks who are, by circumstance, right? They've been forced to catch those glimpses of resilience and strength amidst horrendous oppression and coercion and having basic human rights taken away from them.
I will just add one more little story here. And by the way, a bunch of you have such great ideas. Please raise your hands and join the conversation. I don't want to be the only one talking. I've got this responsibility not to leave any dead air here. About 10 years ago, I went to hear a lecture by Terry Waite, an Anglican bishop. If any of you know that story, Terry Waite was kidnapped by revolutionaries in Iran and held captive from 1987 to 1991. And it was very interesting. But here's the thing I'll never forget about the lecture. When it came time to ask questions, the group that was largely Seventh-day Adventist, not entirely, but largely, somebody raised their hand and said, "But Dr. Waite, Bishop Waite, didn't you really feel the God's strength coming to you as you were there and being chained to that radiator for 4 years? Didn't you come out of this as a stronger Christian with more faith in God?" He said, "No.
Nope.
I didn't get anything out of it. There was no spiritual growth there. There was nothing that I can walk away with and say, wow, that really changed my life." No, it just didn't happen.
Nope. It's absurd.
And that was hard for the group that was listening to take. It's not what people wanted to hear. They didn't want to hear him say it was a meaningless waste of 4 years of my life with nothing but suffering, that I came out feeling no better or closer to God or any more miracles than when I went in. It was hard for me to hear. And I thought I was a little bit of a cynic. already, but it was hard to hear. I wanted him to say that.
Mm-hmm. Ed, it's good to see you again today. Please share your ideas with us and with Dr. Washburn.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Washburn. I always enjoy your presentations. So it seems to me, not just to me, but having read some psychology books and whatnot, that a few generations ago, the character of ethics was important, like someone's, say, humility or sense of justice, of integrity, of courage. You know, those were important characteristics to have. There was a focus on, you know, your place in society, family, and all these kind of things. But it seems in the last generation or so that there's been more of a personality ethic. You know, what is my image? What do I look like on social media? And politics, for example. I live in Canada, but the politics here in Canada compared to the United States, in the United States, it seems like it's an ongoing thing. You know, when one election's over, they're already out there for the next election, even if it's 4 years away. Mm-hmm. We don't really have that. Things are more confined, and sure, we have our politics, and so I just wonder if you kind of agree with that kind of an outlook, that we are now in a society, not in the entire world or anything, but the developed world, I think, there's a focus more on how we come across as a personality, our own personalities. Things are more political. It's what we say, whereas what our actual character is in terms of my personal character. So character ethics, humility, courage, justice, integrity, those kind of things. How do I look? How do I look to society, to others? Personality ethics. That's my question. Do you agree there's been that shift?
I don't, but I also own the fact that I'm speaking out of limited experience. So, you know, I'm 41 years old. And I think the phrase that comes to mind when I hear your description is an emphasis on reputation management. And that's one of the core wounds I think I carry with me from my family of origin, where really managing how people perceived us was important to my parents' livelihood. And then working for the church, you know, throughout my adult life, and feeling tremendous pressure to control how people perceived me, and not just feeling it, but sometimes being explicitly told that my job was to protect the reputation of the institution. And so it feels to me like it's always been a both and. There have always been people leaning into virtue ethics and asking, like, what kind of world can we make by putting our attention toward what kind of person we can be in the world, what kind of community we can be in the world. And there have always been people who are scared. There have always been institutions who feel threatened, who have tried to get us to put our focus on reputation management. And I mean, I see it all. I absolutely see students in my classes now who feel tremendous pressure to be perceived a certain way. And I also see students who, it's been interesting to me recently to notice that speaking up for human dignity, it can't necessarily be selective. The students who are speaking up for human dignity in the most sustained and consistent ways are speaking up for the dignity of all. So it's the same students who are speaking up for Palestinian rights, who are speaking up for queer rights, who are speaking up for asking the university to align their actions with the stated value of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that we would not invest in, just like we don't invest in alcohol or cigarettes, we wouldn't invest in weapon manufacturing. And people who are naming discriminatory practices and inconsistencies in our policies, right? I've just noticed that it's many times it's the same students who are asking questions and who are speaking up on behalf of the dignity of other humans in all kinds of areas. So I think that from my perspective, there's always been that thread throughout my life of being scared and focusing on reputation management. And then there's been this other thread of people who really ask what kind of person or what kind of community can we be in the world?
Yeah, so a secondary question, thank you for that answer. A secondary question or comment might be, that's great. You know, I agree that's wonderful that messaging is getting out there. But how much effect is it really having? Because with media control, maybe that's the way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what gets in the media, what gets covered, including social media, and you know that's where a big emphasis. The message becomes the reality. It seems not so much of what is actually going on.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess again, I would say both and. There are so many of us who walk around with carefully curated media feeds so that we only ever hear things that, you know, it's confirmation bias. We're like, we feel better about ourselves because we only read things that agree with what we already think. But again, like I would say throughout my life, there have been both and, right? There are people who are determined to seek truth and to ask hard questions. And there are people who are content to just kind of marinate in confirmation bias. And I see the same thing among my students now. I see students who are, you know, really overconfident and underinformed. And I see students who intentionally, I was just talking to a student last night. He was telling me about some stuff that he had learned on TikTok. And I was like, man, I'm the one who should be aware of this, not you. Like I'm the religion and sociology professor. Like, how have I not heard about this? So we started talking about his TikTok feed and he told me, oh yeah, I intentionally subscribe to like kind of, I don't know what it's called on TikTok, but the way he described it is like groupings of information. He intentionally subscribes to multiple of these so that he is routinely getting points of view from all different angles, and he's sitting with those that information and the interpretations of current events. And so there are plenty of people, and I think there always have been, who are bucking that system and saying, no, I'm not going to live at the mercy of an algorithm. I am going to intentionally sit with the fuller range of human experience. And yeah, that's been true throughout my life, even though I suppose, we're all victims in one way or another. I mean, I love teal, and I get advertisements on Facebook for like teal shoes that are in the exact style that I like, even though I've never once shopped for a teal shoe ever. I mean, we are all the victims in one way or another of terrifying algorithm power, but I don't think that everybody is swept away by that.
Jerry, you're back in with some new ideas. Thank you.
I want to pursue it a little bit into application, perhaps. And I've got sort of a two-pronger coming up. Number one, and maybe the simpler, I deal with a lot of hospice patients now. It's sort of my vocation after I quit my private practice of medicine. And I constantly deal with people who have chosen, I'm not going to say run away. They've chosen no longer to pursue aggressive interventions for their perceived terminal illness.
Mm-hmm.
They've had the guts to make the right choice. And it upsets me when family members won't accede to their wishes or believe that they themselves could do better or could fight more valor. Why can't we accept a legitimate choice? Do we need to be convinced or hit over the head with these things? So that's one observation that's practical.
Mm-hmm.
But the more concerning one is, how can I make my church a more accepting, free place to worship God within my culture? Even today in church, there was a woman up front leading song service, and she was flagrantly raising her hands and smiling as she sang. And it was discordant with the rest of the congregation. What is a man to do in a situation like this?
Mm-hmm. We're scared. I know when I've behaved in the way that you're saying, where I try to say, well, I would fight more. I would seek treatment more aggressively. I would this or that. It's always out of fear. We're scared of our own mortality, of the uncertainty of our own lives, and we lash out against other people.
Yeah, maybe we're too tenuous about our own hold on life itself, eh?
Yeah, or maybe we don't feel like we can grasp our sense of agency, so we're threatened when other people do. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, and there is a sense in which just because we have the freedom and the capability to do something does not necessarily mean that we should. Dolly Parton in her Dallas Cowboy outfit comes to mind at the Super Bowl.
Thank you. Not that you're not a Cowboy fan. I'm okay with that.
Yes, I am, but that just sort of took it beyond the pale for me.
Understood.
Dr. Washburn, I wish that, Ray and Bobby, you've got something else. Go ahead, Ray. I'll need to ask you to unmute. Let me do that for you here. Here we go. I want to ask Dr. Washburn a question about her pictures, but bring out your point first.
I would like to hear Dr. Washburn's idea or opinion on, after or being involved in this study about freedoms, what do you think, or how do you think or feel that God views freedom? You've expressed what you see as us and humans. If you were talking with God, what do you think he might say about freedom?
Good
question.
I think, man, there's so many ways I could go with that. I could write you off and say, like, I'm not God and I don't want to go there. Part of me wants to say that. I don't know. But there's a conversation that I've had with students over the years, and the students have said it was helpful. So maybe I could share a couple of points from that. And I'm not sure, it might be only tangentially related to this conversation about freedom, but I read a few years ago Elizabeth Gilbert's book entitled Big Magic. It's her kind of nonfiction book about the creative process. And reading that book, I had a number of moments where I found myself wondering, is that what it's like for God? She would tell stories like where you pour your entire heart and soul into a project or into something, and you give it, you are offering in a very vulnerable way. You're taking creative risks, like an artist or a novelist or a poet, or whatever medium you're doing, but the creative enterprise is inherently vulnerable and risky, and also creates the possibility for astounding beauty. And listening to her speak about that, she said something along the lines of how, as an artist, if someone like just discounts what you've done with no curiosity, no ability to sit with what you were trying to accomplish, or what part of your heart you poured into it, or how it's fitting, or like nothing, how painful that can be. And listening to her writing on that, I was listening to it while I was driving as an audiobook, and it just got me thinking about, and at that time I was teaching Hebrew Bible courses, big general studies, Hebrew Bible courses. And I was telling my students, it's so interesting to me to read the Hebrew Bible and say, okay, we talk about this collection, this library of texts. We talk about it as, like I used to use the phrase, God shepherded the whole process. So God was present in the, the writing of the poetry, the inspiration, the people had a story that they felt compelled to tell, right? And they told it around the campfire, then they told it again. And then generations later, somebody put money into writing it down. And then later on, people put money into passing it, making copies. And later on, people put money into having these councils that decided which parts of these stories and poems and books would be collected into what we call sacred scripture. And I just really remember being struck by, like, almost with a sense of awe that God was fine with humans doing that whole process. And God was somehow fine with being what I would consider grossly misrepresented. And God was fine with contradictory voices being there, and fine with the idea that, as the generations of humanity would continue, that we would get to continually partake in that ongoing dialogue and process of discernment. And God was fine in pouring out God's heart, right, in vulnerable ways, saying how much he longed for the people to love one another, even though he knew that wasn't possible. And God was fine setting in motion. I mean, whether you think of it as the Big Bang or whether you think of it as like a 6-day creation a few thousand years ago, whatever. But God was fine setting in motion the framework of reality within which we function, right? And deciding what would be possible and not possible within that framework, and knowing that it would come at a cost, that it would come with the potential of incredible beauty and connection and healing, and the potential of tremendous harm and pain and discomfort. And I don't know, it just got me thinking about, I don't really know anything about God. Sometimes I'm not one, maybe this is too personal for this space, but I'll just say it because I don't teach in the theology department anymore. I've never been a person who experienced God as a mind in the sky. I encounter the divine through nature. I encounter the divine through my interactions with the beautiful people that God has put in my life. And yeah, that's messy. And it makes it, yeah, I certainly am not in a place to say, God told me to tell you that. And I'm okay with that.
We are too. We are too. This bunch. Well, Dr. Washburn, Bill Garber, who is one of our regulars here, has posted something in the chat wherein he says, freedom from fear is sometimes a threat to those who fear. Yeah. And I think he'd like you to comment on that. Do you need him to give you a for instance?
No, I mean, Bill, is there anything you want to say about that?
I don't have a for instance.
Yeah. The only thing that comes to mind for me, because I'm saying that investing in the healing journey individually and collectively is the purpose of life. This is how we engage as co-architects with God. And so what comes to mind for me is, what are the things that are the biggest barriers to the healing journey? It's shame. It's fear. It's a sense of isolation. So I guess just, yeah, not that we need to pretend those things don't exist, right? But to recognize that they are barriers in the healing journey, and that I think God has put within our hearts and built into our bodies somehow, despite all odds, to access resilience and a sense of options as we grow and mature as humans, to access a sense of options that I can, I think it was Jerry who said this, maybe I have the opportunity to act, and then to take responsibility for that action, and you know, be aware of how it affects other people and reach out for repair, and then to take another action, you know, like, but yeah, I think fear and shame are huge barriers to healing, and they have been leveraged as weapons by the fundamentalist religions.
But Bill, is it because you think that people who are not afraid is fearsome to those who do? Is it because it creates broader vulnerability, or the potential, the fear of broader vulnerability?
It seems so, and perhaps if we sense that we are all in this together, not to some degree, this is a plight, the human experience.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't negotiate our way in.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we think we're going to negotiate our way out?
Mm-hmm.
If we are the result of God's creative endeavor, we are all the result of God's creation.
That's right.
There are no exceptions.
Mm-mm.
Which then raises the supposed solution to the circumstance we find ourselves in, which is often described as the solution to sin.
Mm.
And the solution to sin amongst Christians is all too often perceived to be the elimination of sin by eliminating sinners,
Mm-hmm.
all of whom are God's creation.
Mm-hmm.
And it for that not to be arbitrary on God's part, we humans have come up with this notion of freedom of choice.
Mm-hmm.
They chose, so they're to blame.
Mm-hmm.
We've attended a few evangelistic series along the way in life, and the typical Adventist evangelistic series will quote a text every 60 seconds until they get to the part of freedom of choice. And they spend 15 minutes arguing in favor of that without ever quoting a text.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are not many texts. I think, yeah. So at once, you know, we dare not make the point that we're exempt from fear. Much better to say we are all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
And is that the three angels' message? We're left to fear God, glorify his capacity, her capacity, the divine capacity to bring justice, to restore justice, and then worship.
Mm-hmm.
These are the part of the human capacity that is not located in the frontal cortex. It's just, it's not a matter of rationality. It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of sensing inevitability, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we fear, we glorify, and we worship. What choice do we have?
Mm-hmm.
Here we are. What'll be, it's in God's hands. Wholly in God's hands.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, Bill, Lauren should get you to write an article about that. In any case, thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think we're all just kind of processing that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much, Bill. Since it's about 3:30, let me see if I can get Olive to. Olive is going to be teaching for us next week. Let's see, where are you, Dr. Hemmings? There she is. Dr. Hemmings, just give us a, before we go on to Dr. Taves and Emmanuel, let me just ask you, what will you be talking with us about next week?
Well, I want to share with the class next week something I shared with chemistry, a biochemistry seminar at Andrews University. I think that was the last presentation. All those were really science, but I wanted to bring into perspective the whole question of scriptures and science. So the topic is scriptures and science, same God, different subjects. So, you know, perhaps we want to continue to pursue the conversation as to whether it's an either or between scripture and science as far as divine revelation. So we want to answer questions like, what is the extent of the authority of scriptures over the scientific discipline? And perhaps so, you know, also ask questions whether the source of biblical revelation is different from the source of scientific discoveries. And so I want to propose a hermeneutic that somewhat hopefully answers the question as to whether it's an either or it's a both and the extent to which, you know, it is a both and or either or. Okay, I hope I give you a glimpse into what I'll be discussing next week.
That sounds really good. Thank you very much, Dr. Hemmings. And I always look forward to you teaching. You're very thoughtful, and you've been a great inspiration to me personally. Trying to remember how long ago it was we met at WIU. I think it was about 10 years ago. I came there, and I rode with you over to a restaurant. I remember that. I can't remember what we were doing, but we did. I've enjoyed being in touch with you ever since. You've done a lot of really good stuff for Adventist today. So that's all I want to say, and we've got a few more people to go here.
And nice to see you, Jody. Now that I'm on mute, nice to see you, Jody. Always great to hear from Jody. And yes, I hope to see you, even though you have defected.
Oh yeah, I'll be in San Diego this year. I wasn't able to get funding last year, but I've got funding this year.
It would be interesting to know what made you make that change. I find it a very interesting change.
And kudos to your sociology, your social work pursuit. I like social work. It's very good. And the clinical aspects, very good. Congratulations.
Jody, can you talk about what made you make that change, or is that too private?
I think it's too private.
Okay, I'm fine with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Let's come to Lena. Dr. Taves, welcome. We're glad you're here. What are your thoughts this afternoon?
Thank you so much, Jody. And I am also looking forward to you coming to San Diego. You know that I am the president of ASRS and would love to see you. Definitely.
Thank you.
Nice to see you on the screen. Please come. And join us on Zoom too. We have Women in Theology group once a month. So I would love to have you there. One is coming tomorrow, actually. So you were invited personally. Yes,
Thank you.
I'm sure you got that email.
Yes, I do. And I'll look for times when I'm free at that hour. Yep.
Sure. Yes. Well, since somebody brought the topic of how does God see freedom and what is in the Bible, and well, I am like Olive. I am a New Testament scholar, so I do work with the New Testament text. I mean, I do work some with Old Testament because, you know, they're very connected. And just today, I was teaching Sabbath school on a different topic, but the topic of freedom somehow got into our conversations and into our discussions. And today we discussed the temptations. They're very interesting and simple at first sight. It's kind of a long exposition here, but I'll try to shorten it. It's not a college lecture. I understand this. So in Mark, obviously, we can see, and Dr. Tonstad wrote some on temptations also in his book, Traditions of Sense, God of Sense and Traditions of Nonsense. So I'll just quickly summarize what I think the scripture is revealing to us. So in Mark 1:12 and 13, it says that the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness, compared to Matthew, where in Matthew it says Jesus was led into the wilderness. So the initiation of Jesus going into the wilderness was by the Spirit, not by the devil, but by the Spirit. So the Spirit of God moved Jesus into the wilderness. The wilderness, again, I'm just quickly summarizing, is Satan's territory, the territory of deprivation, the territory of hunger, thirst, and every deprivation you can imagine. And that same word that is used, ekvalo, some of you may know, that is used in Mark, is the actual meaning is he threw him into the desert, or he ejected him into the wilderness, or he catapulted him into the wilderness. So it was this big urgency of putting him in there. So he threw him into there. And that same word is used 17 times in the Gospel of Mark. In 11 of those times, that same word is used in connection to exorcisms, in Jesus throwing out the spirits out, demonic spirits out of the people. So to make it short again, he threw him into the wilderness, into the territory of Satan, so that Jesus could throw Satan out of this whole situation and out of the earth. So, and then when we moved, and this is all that's explicitly said in Mark. Then we go to Matthew. I'll get to our topic. Sorry, it's the background information that's important. So then we get to Matthew. And in Matthew, in the first temptation, of course, we know that Jesus is at the point of deprivation. And here is the cunning voice of Satan, the same voice that was there with Eve. Aren't you hungry? Why did God let you get to this point, right? How could he let, nice, it's under text. I mean, it's not explicit, but you have to read the text closely. Are you hungry? Are you deprived? How did your loving God get you to this point? Isn't that horrible? Okay, if you go back to Genesis 3, verse 4, it's the same thing. Come on, Eve, he is, he got you to this point. Well, it's okay. You can eat. It's all right. Take it from the tree. Okay, back to Matthew. So he's using that voice of God's restrictive measures, or maybe restricting some sort of freedom of human race. See what I'm saying? So no, there are rules. And we have a prompter there who tells us God is a terrible God. He's gotten all of these rules in place. And if you disobey him, wow, it's terrible, you know, he's such a terrible God, all right, because he's restricting your freedom. Don't you see? He's restricting your freedom, all right, with Eve, and then we go to Jesus. So the next temptation in Matthew, again, we're continuing verses, I think, 5 and 6. He, and progression again, from the wilderness, now he moves him a little bit further up. He puts him on the top of the pinnacle of the temple. And he says, what does he say? He says, come on now, I didn't work the first time in his mind. I'm just extrapolating here a little bit. In Satan's mind, it didn't work to say that God is so restrictive and terrible. So let's try a different tactic. So what I'm going to do now, God is so wonderful, and he's just absolute supporter of you, and which he is. That's what I believe. And but go ahead, get yourself off the cliff, and he'll lift you up, no problem. He's right there for you, isn't he? So go back to Eve, the same thing there. He says, well, you will be speaking like him. You will be like gods. Come on, take that fruit. You know, the same logic. So first we're doing one thing. Now we're using a different tactic to get to Jesus. And what is Jesus saying? No, he's not getting the bait, right? So because Jesus says that freedom is not the lack of human responsibility. Mm-hmm. That's the second temptation. Now we're getting to the third temptation. When we get to the third temptation, we're moving further. Remember, there was the desert, and then we are where? On the top of the temple. And where are we now? Now we're on the top of the world, the progression. And now it's no longer between Jesus and obedience or disobedience to God. Now it is the relationship between Jesus as God and Satan. And of course, that if phrase can be debated in many ways, but since you're the Son of God, go ahead and do this, right? He takes him all the way to the top of the world, and he says, if you worship me, the word worship, again, there in the original presuppose adoration. If you adore me, then you're okay. You know, your freedom is not in any way compromised. And his response is, away from me, Satan. And then we get to chapter 27 in Matthew. And of course, there, the same logic is going on. If you're the Son of God, get yourself off the cross. What's your problem? And that's the total conquering and throwing out the evil out of this world that started at temptation. Same exact phrase is used. Since you're the Son of God, claiming to be one, go ahead and do that. So I've already interjected some of this freedom issues. I think God is not restricting our freedom, but God at the same time is not eliminating a part of responsibility on humans. So from these encounters is my little exegetical analysis of just one passage. There are so many others and different ways of interpreting different things. This is how I see God operating and acting in this world based on these New Testament passages. That's it.
Dr. Washburn, comment on it?
Oh, thank you. It's great to see examples of this, both and.
Right, and seeing God.
Responsibility and agency.
Right, I see God, and thank you so much for your wonderful insights, also from other areas and perspectives. So anyways, thank you.
Well, Dr. Paves, you also bring up, you've added more examples and clarity to the idea that there's a certain relevancy or relativeness to freedom, and lens through which we look at it. Exactly. That broadens out the scope of this a great deal. Thank you so very much. Emmanuel, it's good to see you. I've asked you to unmute. What are you thinking this afternoon?
I don't know yet. Dr. Washburn, I really enjoy your presentation, and let me tell you why. It seemed to me you scream from the top of the roof what we whisper in the basement. So you talk about freedom and responsibility. And the question I ask, how this is possible in our community of faith when the president of the General Conference say we are going to have some people looking at higher education. So everybody speak the same language. We are at the same time at the same place. And I wonder, when we talk about responsibility, is responsibility for who? For me, the speaker, or for GC? Now, I have a book here written 20 years ago, Toxic Faith, Experiencing Healing from Spiritual Abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, in academia, we are in quest of truth. Can we look for truth if we have already the answer to every single question asked or not asked yet? So in the church setting, how we implement what you just shared with us without walking on anybody's little toes.
Mm-hmm. Not possible.
Short answer.
I never, I mean, I think that's partly what, I think that's partly why I find the attachment theory lens to be helpful in this regard, because for some people, the church community can be their, what's the other word besides safe haven? Their anchor point, like a child would turn back and look, you know what I mean? And then take another risk, experiment, try something else, and then turn back and look for that connection. And for some people, the church can be that. And for some of us, I speak for myself in this regard. I have pretty significant wounds connected to the church. And so I've had to get that kind of support elsewhere. A lot of my support comes from people outside of the Seventh-day Adventist community. And I have found tremendous options for support. And so I think, first of all, as Rabbi Adanya Rutenberg says when she presents about repentance and repair in the Hebrew Bible, she's very direct. She said, we all cause harm. We all have been harmed, and we all have been bystanders to harm. And so no matter how secure the attachment or how much safety is accessible to us in whatever way, through God or through the people God has put in our lives or the situations, there's always going to be discomfort and pain, and people are going to get hurt. And the question then is, what's the appropriate response in that way, right? How do we take responsibility? How do we stay present? And so, yeah, I don't think it's possible to not step on toes. And I don't think it's possible for everyone to confront powerful people. My goal is to be invisible. I hope nobody knows that I'm here or what I think. But thank you all for listening.
Before you go,
thanks for letting me think out loud with you all. But like, my true hope is that to the church itself, I am invisible, and that I can just do my work with the few students that pass through my corner of the world. And I have no interest in conversing with the powers that be.
Before you go, I enjoy the presentation on Sabbath afternoon, and oftentimes I tell my wife, I hope he has a job on Monday. I hope she has a job on Monday.
Yep. Emmanuel, well, no, I changed jobs, I'm a sociology professor now who's getting trained to be a clinical social worker. So I can say things now that I couldn't have said yet last year. So.
Well, and to add to Dr. Washburn's short answer, Emmanuel, we have a saying here, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. Your freedom ends where my nose begins. It's an old saying.